Welcome to a topic of discussion. 9/11 has been very much in the news recently as we approach the 10th anniversary. However, our purpose here is not historical. Tonight, we want to look beyond history at other possible responses to the events of that day. First, you will hear a panel discussion by three people whose work involved them in the events of that day. Let me introduce the members of the panel. Janet Horton, over here, was a Christian Science chaplain at the Pentagon on 9/11. She also served in the U.S., Germany, and Korea as a chaplain in the U.S. Army, and was the first woman to reach the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps. She supervised religious support for the Joint Task Force in Albania, Macedonia, and Kosovo. She holds a Master's of Divinity from Boston University and a Master's in Religious Studies from Stanford. Janessa Gans Wilder, also here to my right, heads the Euphrates Institute, which is dedicated to finding a world beyond 9/11 through Albert Einstein's insight that problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. Previously, while an analyst at the CIA, Janet worked in Iraq preparing for its 2005 elections. Besides heading the Euphrates Institute, she is also an advisor to the State Department and a visiting professor at Principia College. Janessa has learned Arabic and travels extensively in the region. She holds a master's degree in international studies from Stanford. Torkel Patterson, our remaining panelist, just at my near right, must be feeling quite at home tonight since he began his career in the U.S. Navy. Besides serving on ships, he learned Japanese and served in key government posts, managing relations with our Asian allies. After leaving the Navy, Torkel served as president of Raytheon in Japan and simultaneously served with the board of the Pacific Forum of Johns Hopkins Center for Strategic and International Studies. On 9/11, Torkel was serving as a senior director for Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. Born in Seal Beach, California, he is a graduate of the U.S. Navy Academy. And farthest over from my right, or farthest to your left, is Mark Swinney, who will be moderating a panel discussion and who is a practitioner and lecturer from Placitas, New Mexico. Mark has served as president of the Church of Christ Scientists, First Church of Christ Scientists in Boston, Massachusetts. He has been a practitioner since 1988 and a teacher since 1997. After the panel discussion, Mark will speak on a healing approach to 9/11. Now, please welcome Mark Swinney and our panelists.
Well, it's so good to be here. There were a lot of reasons not to come, I know, tonight. The game's on TV and the other game's on TV. And so I appreciate this commitment that we've all made to be here. You know, a lot of times at an event like this, the audience is here to get something. But I know that here we're going a little further this time. We're interested in gaining ideas in which to give something back to the world. And so I understand why you're all here. And I've got a very interesting group of people that will help to point us in some very healing directions. You know, I think here it's been 10 years since 9/11. And sometimes, in regards to 9/11, it feels like you're almost in one of those loops you might see at a repeating movie. We just see the same scenes, the same pictures, the same buildings, and it almost feels like it's the same day as 9/11. We're just reliving the same feelings over and over, year after year after year. And while it's so important not to forget the contributions people made, the sacrifices people made, to bring healing to the world is our duty now. And we're going to spend the next a little more than an hour getting some good tools with which to help pray for our world. Now, I want to ask Janet first. Tell me what was your role personally on 9/11 that day?
I was with 3 other chaplains that were outside because everybody had been evacuated.
You were at the Pentagon?
Right, at the Pentagon. And it would be common for chaplains to go in with any kind of rescue workers or the firemen in any kind of situation like that and pray with the casualties. And so the 3 chaplains that were in that end of the Pentagon, we were trying to get back in, but the man who had tried to go in had been threatened that, you can't go back in there. And it was just very clear to me, if God opens a door, no man can close it, and that our right place was to be in there praying. And at that time, they were putting together the medical teams, and I said, well, we're just going to fall in with the medical teams. And as we ran down the cement corridor in, the security people threatened to stop us again, and because I had cooked for them on Thanksgiving and Christmas, they knew me personally. They came to me to speak to them with authority, and I said, this is doctrinal. Chaplains need to be with these teams, and we are going in there to pray with those casualties. And the man who was the head of security said, okay, Chaplain Horton, you can go on in. So I was grateful that God put us in the right place, put us together, people of 3 very different faiths, but it was just lovely to go in together. And there was such a sense of unity. And after that, we were able to go in and kneel beside the casualties as they were brought out and pray with them in a manner that was meaningful to them. We would not assume they want to pray. We asked. Every single person said, I want to pray. And then we would ask what their tradition was so that you would pray in a manner that was meaningful to them. And then we chose a scripture or something we knew that would be meaningful to them. And they would many times hold your hand, or sometimes they would put their hand up by their face or whatever. And it was just a very loving response.
These were people, all of them were employees?
They were people that the firemen had found who had been working in the building. There's about over 24,000 people work in that building, and so they were searching each area to find out if there was people in need. And every single effort by anyone that day was focused on what is the need of that person who's coming out.
How many people were you praying with? Did you think?
Oh wow. The details of that day kind of all compressed to me. It seemed like there were probably 30, 40 people maybe that came into our area. I know there were other areas where casualties were being taken up. And I don't know how many other folks saw. But again, what struck me was the unity of effort, that every person in there were people who took their clothing off because somebody's shirt was burned off or something like that, and I mean, it just did not matter. I saw a 2-star general kneeling on the ground scraping up ice because we needed it to go for the water for the firemen. And so you just, the whole sense in there was that there was no fear. That was the other thing that was very striking to me. And that's what people ask so many times, well, weren't you afraid? And my feeling was this fear is a selfish emotion. And no one was focused on themselves. Every single person who was in there was focused on what can we do for that next person that was brought out. And the need was for love. It was for understanding and support. And it was so evident. And it just was felt throughout the courtyard.
So, as quickly as things were happening, and how it almost felt surreal, you didn't feel exactly as you would have expected to feel in that time. You didn't have feelings of being in shock. What would you say? God was taking care of you too in order to help them. What was happening with you?
Well, I had been called from the other side of the Pentagon fairly near where the plane hit. I'd been pulled to the opposite side, and it was interesting because as I left my office to leave to go to this appointment, it came to me to go back and bring my weekly Bible lesson. And it was so interesting because those lessons are prepared months in advance in order to be distributed. And there was a section in there that was devoted to reducing inflammation. And it was the very passages, those were many of the Bible passages that I would kneel and pray with the casualties. And they were so appropriate for that day. And I will be with you and I will heal you of your wounds. I mean, there were so many Bible passages that spoke exactly to what people needed to hear that day. And so I think having prayed about that, even the night before, I'd been going home and there were some clouds gathering and thunder, and my thought was just drawn to it. And it was almost like a thought in my head was speaking very loud, and it said, pray about the gathering of malice. And so I spent until 2 a.m. that morning praying about the concepts of the thoughts that were coming to me was that Mary Baker already talks about in Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She talks about how there's a superiority of moral power over physical power. And I was thinking about the difference between moral and physical courage. It took physical courage to drive a plane into a building, but it took moral courage to do what the American people did in such an amazing manner on that day, to help everybody that needed help.
Janessa, how about you? What were you doing that day, and what was your personal role?
Yeah, well, I was actually very far away from Washington, D.C., in Omaha, Nebraska, at the United States Strategic Command. We were in the middle of a training program, and I was in the midst of a military briefing, and another soldier walked in and whispered into our briefer's ear, and he just turned pale, and we were immediately ushered out into this other room, and just in time, they had these big TV monitors up to see the second plane crash into the building, and then shortly after that, the military official said that we needed to evacuate the base because President Bush was on his way to STRATCOM, to that base, because they have a super safe secret bunker on the base, so we had to bus back to D.C. But what was most interesting about when that moment actually happened was that my colleague who had been working on the terrorism desk at the agency immediately turned to me and said, "It's a terrorist attack, it's Osama bin Laden." And I didn't know who she was talking about, and I just couldn't believe that she could say with such certainty she knew when she heard that a plane had crashed in the building that it was a terrorist attack. And as so many Americans, I think just in that instant, my life changed. I've been working on Africa issues. All of a sudden, I was moved over to a task force on Afghanistan. I spent 2 years working on that issue. Then I signed up to go to Iraq for 3 months, which turned into another almost 2 years. And it was really motivated by that. I think what was motivating a lot of us was to understand why 9/11 had happened. How could we have been so unprepared for this event? And we had just been studying for 5 months prior to that how different intelligence failures had happened, like the fall of the Shah in Iran and Pearl Harbor, and we'd just been studying all these things about, well, how could they have missed these clues, and how could that have happened? And here, this failure, intelligence failure, had happened again. And I really wanted to understand more and go to the root, and that's what was really prompting me to go to the region and meet these people and understand more about Islam and the Middle East and the region and what was driving this, what was causing this, and what could we do to prevent another one from happening.
So you didn't just have the desire but didn't act on it. You acted on it when you're talking about wanting to know more. Mm-hmm. What were some of the specific things you did in the year or two following 9/11?
Yeah, so again, Afghanistan was my entree into this, and just really following the political process and learning more about Islam, especially in that region, and kind of tribal politics. But I never got to go. And it was really bothered me in a way to be called an expert on a country, and I'd never met an Afghan, I didn't speak the language, I'd never been to the country. And so when the Iraq opportunity came up, I said, I will do anything to escape my cubicle in Washington, even if it means going to a war zone. And I just couldn't wait to get on the ground and smell the earth and meet the people and learn the language and actually learn, have a human connection to this and see the reality on the ground. It's not enough to just read it in a book or on our computer or even hear a lecture. It's just to really connect directly. And I just had the most amazing time and experience meeting Iraqis, working directly with them in that experience that I kept enlisting more and more and more to the extent that it ended up being 2 years that I was there.
Oh, goodness. Torkel, where were you that day?
Well, thank you. I was 9 o'clock in the morning. I was in the daily situation briefing that we did with the National Security Advisor every morning. And the National Security Advisor walked in and said, a small plane has hit the World Trade Center. Where's so-and-so, who is in charge of counterterrorism? And so they said, well, he's at breakfast. And she said, well, go find him or something. So then she said, sit down, let's get this over with. And then she was handed a slip of paper. A few minutes later, stood up and just said, this meeting's finished, and left the room. And I went out the other room of the sit room into the ops center, and there on the screens were the plane, the replay of the second plane going in there. So it took a few minutes to sort of grasp the picture there, and then I went back to my office, which wasn't in the West Wing, but next door, and to see my staff very, very fearful and panicked. And there was a lot of misinformation going around that day in Washington that the smoke that was coming from the Pentagon that had been hit was blowing across the mall, and people said it was hitting the State Department. So people that worked at the State Department that were working with us were panicked. And so I just let everybody go home. And then the thought came to me to go back to the West Wing. And like Janet's situation, it was very, very calm, peaceful. And everybody there was extremely quiet. And no one was, it was just very, very quiet. And sort of helped a few people get where they needed to go, because I'd worked there at a previous time and I knew where things were, so I directed people there. And then I just went into the situation room, the ops center, and tried to be helpful in a practical way, answering phones until the next shift came that had been given off duty came back to manage that. And then I sat there and just try to be quiet and listen for what to do. And these two staff members from the other side of the White House, meaning when you work on national security, the other side is the political side. And they came in and said, what do we do? What should we do? And they were a little bit, and so I took them in another room and I said, well, let's just think this through a little bit. And the thought came that no one has talked to the American people yet about this. And the people haven't heard anything other than, we're attacked and what's on the news, but there's been nothing out of the White House about it, and nothing out of the Pentagon or anything. So I said, what we need to do is to get somebody to stand up in front of the American people and tell them where everybody is, that everything's okay, and we're working on it. The president's here, the vice president's there, and we're working on it. And also not to have a I am in charge moment for someone. So I recommended that they have Karen Hughes come out and speak, because she was an authority figure, and I gave sort of the talking points, and 15 minutes later Karen Hughes came out and held a press conference and did my talking points. So that was my little contribution for the day. But I think more than that was just the sense of listening and trying to put everything in perspective. And there was a plane that was flying. You remember that day, there was trying to get all the airplanes down. There was an order that went out that all the airplanes needed to be manned. And there were two groups. The White House immediately divided, the government divided into two groups. One group was, let's defend the United States, because we don't know if this is one attack and what's next. So let's immediately try to defend the United States. And that was the vice president was working on that. And then the next group was, who did this and why? And what's tomorrow's answer? So the Pentagon and the vice president were working on the first one. And the State Department and the
agency people were working on the second part, and they sort of divided to do that. And I was sort of involved in the defending the United States half, because that's what was happening at the Ops Center, because they were getting direction, and because of the communications, et cetera, it was going through. So I was just listening to that, and there was an airplane that was flying from Korea. It was a Korean airline flight. That the airplanes have something between the seats called IFF, and it's identification vendor foe, and you have to. All airplanes have something they swat. They beep that I'm a 747 and I'm flying at this altitude and this high, but there's also a little number you can turn that says I'm being hijacked. And this airplane had the I'm being hijacked code was being sent out, and it's flying up over Alaska. And the order went out to the from the White House that to send a pilot up from Elmendorf Air Force Base near Anchorage and to have him go up and see the situation. And if he didn't do exactly what you said, then shoot the plane down. You know, and I thought, oh, this is not good. So I just went and prayed that there would be calm there. You know, the people would be thoughtful and calm at that time. And so, anyway, the guy that went up, an Air Force pilot, he was exactly that. And he went up and just looked in the cockpit and, you know, sort of checked out what's going on in there, and then talked to him, and the guy made a mistake, and it just, and that button made a mistake, and he just totally got landed caliber. So I was, I was just grateful at that point for calmness and peace, and I felt very calm that day, and I talked to my wife and told her I wouldn't be home till later, and then about 5 o'clock, I didn't think there was more I could do when I walked home, but 2 or 3 days later, I was just overcome with a lot of emotion because I sort of hit me then that those people that had been, went down in flight 93, I think it was, the 93, the one that went down to Pennsylvania, one of the places that they could have been going to was the White House. It was the White House or the Capitol.
Could you use the microphone?
He's using it.
So one of the places that flight may have been going to was...
Not that one, up here?
Just pin it here.
No, it's not. It's a bad mic.
Yeah, it's
Not working well?
The mic went out.
Is that working better if I talk about that?
The mic went
It's
out.
going in and out.
Oh, good idea.
How's this?
Turn yours off then.
Okay, come on. How's this?
It's not on.
Not on? Well, I can talk like this.
There, wait a minute, it's on
Does that
now.
go on? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, all right, good. So I think it just goes in and out if I don't speak, if I move my mouth too much.
Is yours on?
Off.
Take off, yeah.
It's off.
It's off.
So, in thinking the 3 days later, the effect of the whole,
Torkel, just
Yeah.
turn it. Just talk. Come away from it and just talk to the group.
Okay.
We all know you.
Yeah.
Is this all right?
That's fine.
So the 3 days later afterwards, I felt this surge of emotion, and I felt very grateful. I felt grateful for those people there because they saved a lot of other people's lives, including possibly my life. And then interestingly enough, thinking about this over this past 10 years and on the death of bin Laden when he was killed, I got very sad. I became very sad. And I had to deal with a lot of sadness because I was sad for what happened on 9/11 again, for all those 3,000 or whoever people that were killed and all the impacts, ripple effects. But I was also sad of the reaction by the United States and all the hundreds of thousands of people that were affected because of that. And I just became sad because there was not only the action, but there was the reaction. And all of that to me was very sad. And so I had to deal with this sense of sadness about it. And then I started thinking between then and now and thinking about tonight, about the idea that the cause. What was the cause? Well, you can say the cause of this was the terrorist attack, or you could say the cause of this was whatever the precursor was that made the terrorists want to do that, or you could say the cause was A, B, C, or E, F, whatever the cause is. But that's not really the cause if you think about it from a Christian Science standpoint, in that God is the only cause and creator, and certainly God didn't cause this. So then you start thinking back and trying to think about, okay, is this really history? Or do we need to really rewrite this history? Do we need to if it wasn't really, if God's the only cause and creator, God didn't cause it, it wasn't caused by God, then, etc. But that's kind of where I'm at today.
All right. Comparing the way you felt that day when 9/11 happened versus how you feel today. I mean, it's been 10 years, and no one in the room here is in the same place they were when on the day of 9/11. We've all thought it through. We've prayed about it. We've had insights. You've really been involved personally with it for 10 years. We all lived our regular lives. You really have been. How would you compare this week, how you're feeling about it, as compared to the day it happened? Yes, you, Janessa.
I think what's really defined my thinking, and then is this my
They're all going.
They're all
going.
going.
Okay.
None of them were.
Don't mind my high-pitched, squeaky voice. It's going to get even squeakier. So what's really helped me is Albert Einstein's quote, and I know Mark read it.
Turn it off, turn it off.
It's the idea off completely.
Please don't. The people overseas looking forward to hearing the recording.
Okay. Well,
But the
we'll talk.
recording isn't connected to the mics, it's just the sound.
So we'll
You can turn
just,
it
okay. So anyway, it's the idea that problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking that created them. And so I think that there is a certain
Janessa,
level-
wait, let's say that. That's an important thing.
It is
say that
huge.
once more again.
Yeah, Einstein said that problems cannot be solved at the same level of thinking, or another translation is the same level of consciousness that created them. So to me, there's a certain level of thinking or consciousness behind 9/11. I mean, think about the malice and the fear and the action and reaction and the division and destruction. And so if we are caught on that level and in a way responding in like manner, the problem's never going to be solved. It's just, it's a question of focus, it's a question of dealing, you can't fight fire with fire. And so what is the level of thinking or consciousness at which we need to be operating that actually solves the problem? And I had a personal experience in Iraq that completely changed my focus. It was as a result of that, I started this organization called Euphrates, but I was sitting next to the banks on the Euphrates River, and I had just spent a week in Fallujah during the major battle there, and I was with the Marines, and I was sleeping in a cot in a bunker with all guys. I was the only civilian woman, and it was just a scene of untold war, in the war zone, death and destruction, people wounded, and just incredible mayhem, and I just was feeling so overwhelmed and so overcome by a feeling of helplessness and hopelessness and fear, and just really seeing a lot of evil incarnate, and just feeling that it was a powerful force. And so a week later, I was sitting along the banks of the Euphrates River and just marveling at what a contrast. It's this beautiful river, this life-giving force in the midst of the desert. It's blue, it's calm, it's got waving bulrushes to the side. It's just the most idyllic picture you've ever seen. And I just felt this moment of peace, and I realized that this same river actually goes right in the midst of downtown Fallujah. It runs through this town, the scene of all this death and destruction, and so the two are happening coincidentally. There's this juxtaposition of a life-giving force and death happening seemingly at the same time. And I was reasoning that actually the river was unstopped. If you look at it as a metaphor, the river of life was unstopped by all the death and destruction happening around it.
And so to me, it seemed that the river was actually the more powerful force going on here. And we tend to be focused on one or the other. And I had decided at that point I would no longer put all my focus and concentration and emotional energy into the scene of evil or into focusing on the death, and instead I would choose life and choose good because it was infinitely more powerful. And that is what, that's what I've been doing since with the organization is where are the stories of hope and the trends of change and all the visionaries in that region and the people in this country who actually represent a very different model and who are actually showing us that problems are solved at a different level of thinking, and they're showing us what that level of thinking is and what's possible and what we need to be throwing our weight behind. And to me, at that moment, it was a matter of focus. And so we can focus on good.
I love it. Now, Janet, would you say that your kind of growth in the way you've been praying it, is it parallel to Janessa's and Torkel's, or?
It's very parallel, and in fact, I think it took hold almost immediately, a change in my thought. I had been working with a Muslim chaplain and endorser to see if we could not bring more Muslim chaplains into the military, and I worked with him very quickly afterwards, and I mean, he was so crushed and so sad, and in a briefing that I did on this particular mindset, which is called divine command morality, I always put a slide up right at the beginning of it that said, don't generalize this mindset to any major faith group that has struggled with it, because all three Abraham traditions, both Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have struggled with persons, and they're small groups of people. You have to not attribute this sense of having gone wrong or misinterpreted things or misunderstood to the entire faith groups. Tiny groups at Waco, or tiny groups in Uganda, or tiny groups of Muslims were responsible for this, and that what I was trying to help them understand was, yes, it could very much be a very difficult situation when those interpretations were taken to extremes, but what was very important was for us as major faith groups to address it within our faith groups and say, how can we help that type of extreme interpretations? Where did that type of, going back to those particular sacred scriptures, where did it get taken off in a wrong direction, in a misinterpretation? And so the understanding was really the way ahead. And from within our own faith groups, we could not point the finger out there at somebody else. We had to deal with them wherever it went wrong, and to know that, again, that we could not generalize a sense of hatred ourselves to whole major faith groups or whole other groups. We've all struggled with this, and so that there was a more intelligent way ahead. What I felt was that we had to use the intelligence that you so beautifully did in your situation. And so in this briefing, I helped them understand what the dangerous elements were and how they had gone the wrong direction, and what perhaps a more productive interpretation of that was. And so I truly believe that the whole point was not to symbolize it with that it was an attempt at making what I called a defining event of hatred. For me, that day will never be anything more than a defining event of love, because of how so many people responded, of every background and of every type of experience. And I mean, Americans as a whole, and probably even anybody else who was in the situation. Taxi cab drivers drove people home free of charge, and I mean, you just saw everywhere you turned, you saw people responding in love, and that's the only thing that truly is a way to do away with hatred. It's not more hatred. It's got to be love. It's like light coming when there was darkness. You don't need more darkness, you need light. And so very much, I was very impressed with your response and Torkel's intelligence and calm in that situation.
This, I have two questions. One, getting back to when she was there with the people being brought out of the Pentagon. There was, you said you prayed with about 40 people. Were there people that were Muslim that you prayed with?
Not in my area where I happened to be. Every person I talked to happened to be Christian.
All right.
Yeah.
Does it's interesting when you're in that scene how you feel very humble, but you really feel the presence of God loving these people you were helping, weren't you?
Correct.
Could you talk a little more about just that? Because I think the group here would be interested in how tangible that love for these people you were helping can be.
I think an experience I had that illustrates that best was the firemen had brought out a man who had jumped out of a second-story window onto cement, and he could not move his legs. And so I was kneeling beside him, and this particular individual, again, we asked what his tradition was. He said he was Baptist, and so I knew he was very sincere about wanting to pray, because he said he did. And as I knelt beside him, he was the only casualty that I worked with that didn't respond right away to sharing the scripture with him or whatever. And all he could say was, I can see what you're doing to me, but I can't feel my legs. And he was just so distraught, and he was not becoming calm like everybody else. And so what I learn, and what I think you learn in these types of situations, is it has nothing to do with humans being equal to it. What I felt like you was that God was equal to any experience. And so I just said, God, I need to know what will help him. And the voice spoke and said, you need to talk to him with more authority. And so I said, now listen, Marion, you're going to listen to me. And he turned right around and he listened to me. But what he listened to was not me, because a scripture came immediately. And because he had jumped from that second-story window, I said, nothing can separate you from the love of God. Not height, not depth, not things present, nor things to come, nor principalities, nor powers. And he just totally calmed down at that point. And it was interesting because that was when they said there was the other plane, and so we needed to medevac or get them out of the courtyard. So we were lifting him to put him on a stretcher, and there were some dried leaves that had gotten in the back of his leg and were hurting him, and he was going, ow, ow, and then it was like all of us realized he was feeling his legs again, and it was just like, yay! And so you could see that scripture had calmed him to the point, and that everybody worked together that was working with him, and when you took him out, he was in a totally different place than he had been. He was completely calm, and we were going out. Now what was interesting was the moral courage he had shown was beyond belief. I only put together the pieces of it when I talked to 2 other people that were casualties that day. And some people had panicked, and so a specialist had taken them and had pushed him out to Marion, who had laid down there on the cement. And even though he could not even move anything other than his arms, he was down there breaking their fall with his arms so that they did not hurt themselves the way he had. And the specialist had put out the fire on another woman and gotten her out the window. And she now lives in Ocala, where I live, and so we've met each other. And so you just saw these extraordinary examples of the moral courage we talked about. And it was just so visible. And the calm and you mentioned it, you can't get at consciousness where it was. You had to lift consciousness to that spiritual level. And the moment that happened, you saw such striking sense of the power of God's presence in people's lives, and when they turn to God and let God be the help and the power in the situation.
Torkel, the scene you were in, you were around a lot of people. You didn't have any moment to yourself at all until you were walking home that day. So, in those kinds of scenes, you remember you hardly had a moment to think a thought on your own. The media was kind of telling you what you thought and replaying the pictures of what you thought. And your friends are talking at you. And to take a moment to be able to honestly think on your own, you might only get just a few seconds. Did anything like that happen for you, or was it an attitude that you attained of calmness? What would you say?
I think it was a gift given to me of calmness.
A gift? Oh, interesting.
I mean, I don't remember consciously trying to think that I was going to be calm. I was just calm. And I could listen very clearly, and I could think extremely clearly. And there was no nothing was going on that was out of the extraordinary in my. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't upset. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't sad. I wasn't angry. I was just present. And I don't think that was me. I think it was a gift that I was given that day or something. But I think it's also a gift that all of us have. It's not me. It's all of us have that gift, because we know that if we turn our thought to God, that we're going to hear God.
Janessa, you heard Janet talk about the generalizations cultures make in the world about other cultures. You know, it's almost tribal. You know, where we say all Muslims think this way, all Muslims do this, all Christians are this way. When, like in Waco, Texas, you know, here someone who represented himself as Christian would be someone who no one would want as his or her representative. It was just a small group. If the whole world judged Christians on what happened in Waco, Texas, that wouldn't be fair. What percentage would you say, for people you know in the United States, generalize maybe a quiet inner mistrust or even hatred of Muslims?
I think it's tough to put a percentage, but I used to think it was a lot fewer, and then I moved to the Midwest, and boy, I would say a lot more now have a really negative impression, and just this, you know, we've heard the term Islamophobia that's raging, which is just fear, and I think a root cause of 9/11 or in the aftermath was fear, and fear governs all of us on so many different levels. And I've been thinking a lot lately about how do we deal with fear, and we have the beautiful Bible quote that perfect love casts out fear. And so if we want to get rid of fear, whether it's this Islamophobia that we may have in the U.S. or in our own lives, then we need to focus on love. And I talk a lot too about how it's not, you know, sometimes we think, how can we have this impact on this huge global issues or global challenges, and there's just, they need to stop hating us and we need to stop doing this, and it just seems huge and a really big challenge to take on. But there's this other wonderful quote that somebody was talking about, Mrs. Eddy, who's the founder and discoverer of Christian Science, and that she understood that the way to universal peace is through the consciousness of the individual. And I love that, because you can't get much bigger than universal peace, and it starts through the consciousness of each individual. And I think it is that way because we have to demonstrate it and understand it in our own lives. And I just think about the 9/11s going on in our own lives all the time. You know, there's conflict going on, there's fear, we're terrorized, and there's terrorism, there's suffering, there's just so much going on in our own thought and in our own lives and in our own communities, and to be able to start there, to really demonstrate it, and to bring in the antidote, which is love, and to really start to do away with all the 9/11s in our individual experiences in our own communities, and that the ripple effects that have, you know, we essentially create little mini security zones or mini peace islands as we really learn to live and as we start to practice and demonstrate these antidotes and the realities of peace and love and understanding, and so that it really does begin with each one of us. And so I just love that idea that as Americans learn more and start to dig deeper into this fear that might be prevalent, or the misunderstanding, or the ignorance, and we're talking about that those qualities are maybe happening on the other side too, but we can't really affect what they're doing. We have to start with our own. We have much more influence and impact over our own selves and over our own lives and our communities and our nation. And so we can't hope that others will start practicing the golden rule if we're not practicing it. So as we really, I just love the sense of empowerment and ownership that we have when we realize, oh, I can start practicing it right now. And the more that I do, then it gives permission and light to others to do so. And then think of the impact that that can have.
Yes.
Another thing that struck me shortly afterwards was that I began to look at what some of the things were that Osama bin Laden had talked about in his, what he called his writings or whatever. And it was interesting because there were things that he said that I thought, well, you know, how we would be very spiritually arrogant or even arrogant as a culture or a civilization to think there was nothing that was wrong with us and that there weren't some valid criticisms and things that he said. And I was very taken with the fact that he said, you know, we really don't want these baser things that are on your internet in our area. And so I thought this is an opportunity for us to look at ourselves as a civilization and as a nation or whatever, and say that every nation, you can name any nation, could never be so arrogant to think that there aren't things that you couldn't do better or that you couldn't, or things that aren't serving you well within your culture or serving you well within your group. And so that this was a good urgency in terms of some self-evaluation and really looking at ourselves and knowing ourselves and responding to some of the valid criticisms, and that if we could be humble enough to do that, then couldn't any civilization that could help us, you know, might be helped by us seeing that and saying there are some valid criticisms here. There are some things we could probably have a higher moral concern about or whatever. So I don't want to outline it because I think it could be done in many ways, but I just thought this is to not be spiritually arrogant or be arrogant as a society, and that's what would help, is to be very humble about it and say, perhaps we've learned more than we thought from these situations.
Are you all hearing well in the back row? Yes. Good. The acoustics here are great. Janet, let me ask you, because I know you've done some study on this. It's really easy. It's easier to just make a generalization about another culture. I mean, we were talking about the football game on TV tonight. The Washington Redskins are playing the New York Giants, and I know that at that game there are fans who really they hate the other team, the other player, because it's so easy. They're just wearing a uniform, and it's that color, that uniform, that helmet. And it's so easy just to make a knee-jerk reaction, I don't like you. You know what I mean? Because of that. Now, you've done some study, I know, on that subject. Maybe a couple of insights about how to get past just doing it that kind of dumb, easy way.
Well, I think it's very important if we want to be in the place of trying to lead thought, to try to help uplift thought, that you have to be a very precise thinker. And so generalizations are just the opposite of that. And so I think what's very important is we can't just rely on a certain rut that we get into in human reasoning. And that's why I think we so much need to turn to Scripture, whatever's meaning it has meaning for us as Scripture. Turn to that, because it's going beyond human theories, it's going beyond human reasoning and saying, God, we know that you're the intelligence that supports the universe. And giving God that greatness and that majesty and that credit as the intelligence that is in our universe. And so can we express that more lovingly? Can we express that more gratefully? Can we express that more inclusively? And so I do think that's why we need to talk to each other more. I think that's why we need to have more dialogue on these types of issues with groups that are from very different cultures and very different backgrounds, and that we together can say we have a dedication to expressing that more loving sense of intelligence, that more affirming sense of intelligence, and that we can, in the military, it was not uncommon for us to take people of many different faith groups. We had 8,000 people that were in a military exercise, and people from every faith group you could name prayed over an 8-week period, and they prayed with what was meaningful from their scriptures that told them that's the source of our safety, is God. And they brought hymns, they wrote prayers, they brought their favorite scriptures that affirmed that, And together, that unity of effort, there was not a single fatality, there was no traffic accidents. Every single thing that came up, the worst thing that happened was one little guy lost his little fingernail. and there were some very difficult things. One of the generals from Germany fell down and passed out, and within less than 2 days, they said he would not return to the exercise. Within 2 days, he was back, and they said the doctors have no explanation for this. But we prayed very specifically about what scriptural safety meant. And so I think if we're looking for a more secure sense of our world, and where does our safety come from, where does our unity come from, we have to go to that higher level of consciousness and know that we need to turn to something very holy and very divine if we wish to understand that better.
Let's talk a little bit about turning to something that's holy like that. Now, I think in a lot of religious traditions, maybe historically, God may be seen as, maybe local and vengeful. What I mean by local, kind of a superhuman Zeus-type character who maybe allows for revenge or even takes revenge. Where would you say, Janessa, your take on God is in regards to that? I want you to know that none of these questions we practiced.
Or the responses.
I thought it'd be better if it was real, you know.
I think with that view or picture of God, I don't know about you all, but I don't feel a sense of security or safety or trust or comfort in that. So what brings me comfort is definitely taking the more New Testament approach about God as a loving God, a compassionate and merciful, who does not, one God and one creation, who doesn't see there's neither Jew nor Greek or male nor female, and just this idea of the oneness of God and the goodness of his nature, and the oneness of creation and the goodness of his nature. But everything about our daily lives tells us that there's these two opposing forces, just incredible good that we see and incredible evil, and that they're constantly fighting each other. And it's really tough to reconcile the idea of these two opposing forces if yet Scripture also tells us that God is one and all-powerful and all good. And so how can it be that there's this other evil force that's always opposing and antagonizing? And so I just don't find any personal comfort or relief or healing or sense of wholeness from the view that it's always a conflict going on and there's always a battle between good and evil, and God is both good and yet he's created evil forces to oppose him. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't bring me that sense of love and peace. So I vote for the side with the one God who's all good.
I think it's interesting. I didn't know Janessa really until, just meeting her. But I can tell you have a lot in your background, and you've had a lot of experiences. You've worked in a lot of areas. But I would say that you left all of that for the idea you just talked about. Would you say so? And I think that's an interesting thing to this group, to see someone who had so many things, she was doing, that the world was and ooh over. And you left that career to commit yourself to the oneness of God and man. Would you say that's kind of it?
Yeah.
That's good. Absolutely. I love to see God have his way with people like that. It is. It's interesting to watch that. Torkel, would you say that your idea of God has changed at all since 9/11?
I don't think it's changed. I would say it's grown up a little bit.
Really?
Because I started going to Sunday school when I was 12, and you sort of, at that time, you hear all these ideas, and you believe in them or you have faith in them, and then things happen and you start to question that. But then you sort of come back around to trying to say, okay, let's assume for a minute that everything that I was taught before is really true. Then let me take it at face value and just talk with authority. So I've very much seen things happen where two things come up in conjunction with this. One is that God is in control. I think to know that and believe that and speak that with authority in a bad time is really good. And if I don't speak it out loud, then I certainly am thinking it. One of my jobs was to travel around the world and talk to the leadership in countries about the U.S. withdrawing from a certain treaty. I think it was the Arms Control Treaty, and I was landing in India just as terrorists were shooting up the Lok Sabha, the Congress. It would be as if a bunch of terrorists went in and started shooting in the Congress here. And so I'm landing there, and I'm meeting with the National Security Advisor in India, and he starts screaming at me because we're not angry enough at Pakistan for this. And so the only thing I could think of in response to that God is in control here. This God is in control. So I think that's a very important thing to think. Don't ever lose sight of that. So for me, that's really tough. And the second one, which we've known intuitively, but I think is really, I just now rely on it so much, in that God is love. And loving, being loving, just melts tough situations. And I've been in throughout the Middle East and, well, not in the war zones, but throughout the Arab Middle East and South Asia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And in situations, you have a choice. You always have a choice. Am I going to react? Am I going to get angry, or am I going to love? I mean, you have that choice. You always have that choice. And I found being loving really helps. And just a sort of a humorous one is because of the position in government and because of the way the rules work in the government, if you're at a certain level in the government, you have to be protected. And to me, it's so humorous. I went to Afghanistan, and I'm standing around in this conference room, and I look, and there's a guy there and who has got a gun, and he's there, but he's not wearing a military uniform. I say, "Who are you?" He says, "I'm your shooter." Like, what does that mean? You just have to laugh and love and that. And then another time I was in a motorcade, and I'm the only one in the motorcade, and there's a vehicle in front of me with troops and a vehicle behind me with troops, and I'm in the middle in a van, and I'm the only one in the passenger in the van, and there's sirens going, and we're dead stuck in traffic. So, and the people in the van, the military guards are sleeping. So you just love and smile and wave at the kids and wave at everybody, and you just have to love. I mean, love really. So I think those two things: God is in control, and God is love, and just love. It just solves a lot.
I can tell you really embody those two ideas. The control of God and the reflected love of God. That really shines in you. I can see that. Yes?
I heard an illustration that I think would be a beautiful illustration of what you said from a prisoner where we give services. And he was explaining, because I think it illustrates how different a situation can be once an individual prays. And he said that he was in a cell, and some guards came in, and they were trying to get a guy, and people weren't doing what they were supposed to do, and they got very angry, and they went over and they grabbed him and threw him up against the wall, and he was like, "What's wrong? I didn't do anything," and he was just reacting himself, rather than, I think in prayer you're responding versus reacting. And so he was like this, and they grabbed him, and they were dragging him off to this single cell where you're put away when you do bad things. And he said that he just was so angry, and they were just being rougher and rougher with him. And he said then all of a sudden he remembered from going to services that he probably should have prayed, because he really hadn't prayed before that. And he said the moment he stopped And he said he just got very still and he started with the Lord's Prayer.